Hello learners, here I welcome you in the second module of this course. In the first module of the course, we have learned the meaning of sampling methods and see the sampling methods in educational research in brief. In the second module of the course, we are going to study probability sampling methods in detail. There are 5 main sampling methods included in probability sampling methods: simple random sampling method, stratified random sampling method, systematic sampling method, cluster sampling method, and multi-stage sampling method. Before we go into deep, let's learn about the meaning of probability sampling methods. A probability sampling is one that have been selected in such a way that every element chosen has a known probability of being included. In other words, probability sampling involves the selection of elements from the population using random, in which each element of the population has an equal and independent chance of being chosen. It is also called random sampling. Characteristics of probability sampling. It refers from the sample as well as population. Every individual of the population has an equal probability to be taken into the sample. It may be representative of the population. So, it can be said that probability sampling methods follow theory of probability that gives equal chance to each and every sample unit to be selected as sample. First, simple random sampling method. It is in which each element of the population has an equal independent chance of being included in the sample. Thus, a sample selected by randomization method is known as simple random sampling. In simple random sampling, most commonly used method is lottery method. Simple random sampling method. It is in which each element of the population has an equal independent chance of being included in the sample. Thus, a sample selected by randomization method is known as simple random sampling because there is no such complex method used to select sample in simple random sampling method. In simple random sampling method, most commonly used technique is lottery method. Let's see the selection process in this. By using the lottery method, there is a need for complete listing of the member of population. It seems you have to note down each of the sample unit of the population. The numbers of all members are written on piece of paper and placed in a container. The researcher draws the desired number of samples from container one by one randomly. This process is relatively easy for small population, but if you have large number of population, then this will be very lengthy, time consuming process. So what is the solution? Stratified random sampling. Stratified random sampling can use when you have large number of population. The population is divided into 2 or more groups, and that groups are called as strata. These strata are based off some characteristics such as geographic location, age, income, status, or other demographic variables randomly selected from each strata. Let's see its selection process. First of all, you have to identify and define the population. Determine the desired sample size is the second step in this process. After defining the sample size and identify the population, next you have to identify the subgroups, and that is nothing but strata, for which we want to guarantee appropriate representation to select sample for our study. Classify all members of the population as members of one of the identified subgroups. In this case, you are going to have sample randomly and appropriately from each strata. Let's see the next, systematic random sampling. It is a type of probability sampling method as it is also follow the theory of probability, in which one or two items are selected randomly, but other items are selected by adding the average sampling interval to the item selected randomly. So, that is why it is known as systematic random sampling. It is also called an nth name selection technique because when one item is selected randomly, that is known as nth item, and then sequentially selecting every nth subject from a list of the member of the population. Let's see its selection process. First of all, you have to identify and define the population, same as the stratified random sampling method. Then determine the desired sample size. Obtain the list of the population that is needed here. Then determine what nth is equal to by dividing the size of population by the desired sample size. And this way you can go with the systematic random sampling. Start at some random place in the population on list and take next nth sequentially. Take every nth individual on the list, and here you have your sample from the population based on desired sample size. Next on the list is cluster random sampling. This is the process of selecting sample randomly from the group, but not individual. Cluster random sampling, the process of randomly selecting groups, not individuals, within the defined population sharing similar characteristics. Cluster itself defines that the selection of sample units in group, but not in individual. Cluster are locations within which group of members of the population can be found. We can take some examples like school or classrooms. Schools of certain regions or classrooms of certain selected schools. Cluster random sampling is done when simple random sampling is almost impossible because of the size of the population. So this is also useful when you have large number of individuals in your population and which you cannot define into strata or some other characteristics. So just imagine doing simple random sampling when population in question is the entire population of Asia. So cluster random sampling can help you in this time. Let's see its selection process. Identify and define the population. As you know, that is important. Determine the desired sample size. Next steps, identify and define the cluster. So this important step in the cluster sampling method to identify what cluster you want to take. Estimate the average number of population member per cluster. Determine the number of clusters needed by dividing the sample size by the estimated size of cluster. Randomly select the needed number of clusters, and lastly include in the study all individuals in each selected cluster. So that's way you can have your sample by cluster sampling method in probability sampling method techniques. Last but not the least, multi-stage sampling method. Multi-stage sampling method is used when you cannot use single random sampling method or single probability sampling method to select your sample for your study. At that time, researchers use more than one sampling method to select their samples. In this case, each stage of selecting sample, researchers use different methods of probability sampling. Let's take one example. If you want to study emotional maturity of secondary school students of Gujarat, in this case, first of all, you divide your population in 4 zones of Gujarat based on the location, north, south, east and west. Then you divide schools of these zones into strata, 9 standard students and 10 standard students. Then you select the schools based on simple random sampling method, and then you select the classes based on random sampling method. Lastly, you take the whole class from the selected school as a cluster, and this way you can have your final sample for the study. This process is multi-stage process and the sampling technique is known as multi-stage sampling method. Thank you. Have a happy learning.